There is a generational war going on right now, and it is deafeningly loud. Boomers versus millennials. Gen Z versus everyone else. Avocado toast versus the housing market. TikTok versus Facebook. Wide leg versus skinny jeans. The arguments are everywhere, across every platform, at every dinner table, in every comment section. And nearly every generation is right in the middle of it. Publicly, loudly, emotionally. Nearly every generation. There is one sitting entirely off to the side of all this, watching it play out, occasionally rolling their eyes, largely staying out of it. Not because they lack opinions, not because they have nothing to say, but because something shaped them, something about the world they came up in, that made this kind of noise feel like it simply isn't worth the energy. That generation is Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980. And by almost any measurable standard, the most consistently overlooked, least complained about, least complained to generation living today. A poll circulated on social media asking people to vote for the most ignored generation. The choices were millennials, Gen Z, baby boomers, and the silent generation. Gen X wasn't listed. That tracks. But here's where most people have it backwards. It isn't that Gen X has been forgotten. It's why they don't appear to care, and what that actually says about the psychology running underneath. Researchers who study identity formation in low supervision environments keep finding the same pattern. People raised with high autonomy and minimal external support develop what's known as an internal locus of control. The deep conviction that your outcomes come from your own choices, not from outside validation or public recognition. When that gets wired into you at age 10, it doesn't just change how you think. It changes what you're even willing to invest energy in. It changes what feels worth fighting for. And for an entire generation, it changed everything, including why they're the only ones sitting out the fight right now. To understand how Gen X got this way, you have to go back to the houses they walked into after school. Empty ones. Gen X were the latchkey kids. Divorce rates climbed sharply through the early 1980s, right as the oldest Gen Xers were entering their teenage years. Dual-income households became the standard, so a whole generation of children came home, unlocked the front door with the key strung around their neck, and worked out the afternoon on their own. Nobody was managing their schedule. Nobody was there watching. The thinking at the time was basic. They'll work it out. And they did. Because they had no other option. For most of them, this wasn't a story of hardship. It was just Tuesday. You got home, took care of what needed taking care of, put on MTV. The self-reliance arrived so early and ran so deep that it stopped registering as independence. It just became how life worked. Researchers call it experience-dependent plasticity. When you practice self-sufficiency every day from childhood onward, it stops being a skill you have. It becomes part of who you are. By the time Gen X hit adulthood, they weren't just able to operate alone. They were most at ease that way, not out of some exceptional character, but because they'd been at it since they were 10. Then Gen X entered the adult world and found the conversation had already started without them. The boomers had commanded the cultural stage since the 1960s. Civil rights, Vietnam, Woodstock, huge, loudly documented events that an entire generation had wrapped their identity around. The media orbited boomers. The political class was boomers, 77 million of them, consuming most of the available oxygen. So, Gen X did exactly what growing up had conditioned them to do. They shrugged, carved out their own space, and kept moving. The culture they created reflected that perfectly. Alternative rock, Clerks, Reality Bites, Slacker. All of it soaked in a dry, ironic sensibility. Not idealists trying to reshape the world, but people who had watched the generation ahead make a tremendous amount of noise and quietly concluded it hadn't amounted to much. Whatever, as a reply to provocation. That was Gen X's contribution to the language, a stance built over years of watching things that were supposed to matter and watching them not matter. Then, the millennials arrived, and overnight, everything was suddenly about them. 83 million millennials entered the workforce with a cultural force that made even the boomers seem understated. Their therapy, their student loans, their burnout, their feelings about their feelings, the media, the advertising industry, the entire cultural conversation, all of it shifted almost without warning. Gen X had been quietly biding their time, watching the boomers hold on to power well into their 50s and 60s, assuming they'd eventually step into leadership. Instead, they got jumped. The boomers were still there, the millennials right behind them. The world moved straight from one to the other. One Gen X writer put it simply, "We built the websites that millennials now spend their lives scrolling, laid the foundation, never got the acknowledgement." By the time Gen Z arrived and the OK Boomer backlash started, Gen X had been passed over twice. They didn't reach for the microphone. They turned back around and went to work. But here's the question almost nobody stops to ask. Is the detachment genuine, or is it something else entirely? Something that resembles not caring, but is really one of the most psychologically sophisticated stances a generation has ever taken. The generational conflict right now is, at its core, a contest over who deserves to be understood. Millennials want acknowledgement for what they've endured. Boomers want credit for what they built. Gen Z wants recognition that the world they're stepping into is harder than the one that came before. All three are real desires for validation, and all three depend on public performance, the viral take, the complaint, the generational call-out, the clapback. Gen X's entire psychological wiring works against all of it. They have a deep, almost constitutional resistance to public earnestness. Complaining out loud about being overlooked is about the least Gen X behavior you could imagine. A leadership coach once quipped that she had no guidance to offer Gen X. They don't need it, they wouldn't listen, and even if they did, they'd never say so. That line spread widely among Gen X. And rather than being irritated, they shared it and went back to not caring. That response tells you everything. Here is the part the generational war story keeps getting wrong about Gen X. While millennials and boomers and Gen Z have been debating who had it toughest, Gen X has been quietly in charge. They currently hold the largest share of senior leadership roles globally. Directors, CEOs, senior managers. They got there with no manifesto, no movement, no documentary about their journey. They also became the bridge generation no one anticipated. Young enough to adapt to the internet completely, old enough to remember life before it existed. They never needed the digital native label. They just figured it out. Same as they figured out the empty house after school. Psychologist Jean Twenge observed that Gen X developed unusually high levels of stress tolerance and self-reliance compared to adjacent generations. Not because they were built differently, but because they had far more practice handling hard things alone, with no applause and no audience. That is precisely what the generational war will never create. Quiet competence, built in private. No camera needed. Gen X isn't indifferent. They're just finished performing. They grew up in empty houses and worked it out. They walked into a room already full and found their own lane. They got passed over twice and carried on. They watched an entire culture organize itself around public validation and quietly decided that wasn't for them. That isn't apathy. That's a value system. One shaped early, tested over and over, and one that never needed outside approval to stay intact. The generational war will wear itself out eventually. The hot takes will stop cutting through. The noise will fade. And when things settle, the generation that never entered the fight will still be there, doing what they've always done, getting on with it quietly, without needing anyone to notice.